Well, all righty. Good afternoon. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. Most of you are familiar with AEI, but for those of you who are joining us for the first time, let me just say a few words about who we are. AEI is a 501c3 not-for-profit corporation. We're a think tank. AEI does not take institutional stances on particular policy issues. Rather, we're a community of scholars, and each of our fellows and researchers is free to follow the facts and analyses wherever they may lead. So let's get to the topic of today's think tankery, the Department of Government Efficiency, aka Doge. As you all know, today's program is titled, How Much Money is Doge Saving Taxpayers? Well, let's talk a little about that. And let's go back to the origins. Seems like it's been around a while, but it was only on January 20th that President Trump signed an executive order that took the existing US digital service and made it into the Doge. Its mission, according to the executive order, is to, quote, implement the president's Doge agenda by modernizing federal technology and software to maximize government efficiency and productivity, end quote. In the early days of Doge, its de facto leader, Elon Musk, said it could find around $2 trillion in government savings, nearly a third of the government's $675 trillion in fiscal year 2024 expenditures. An awfully big number. Mr. Musk later revised that figure to $1 trillion, and that seems to be the target they're gunning for. Since its founding, Doge has moved quickly and aggressively to cut contracts, grants, and building leases, and along the way it's posted screenshots and budget numbers to its wall of receipts in the process. As of today, April 7, Doge estimates it's achieved about $140 billion in savings so far. Certainly, Doge's actions are unprecedented, and those numbers sound awfully big. But how much money is Doge actually saving? How does impoundment factor into this conversation? And what role should Congress play in this budgetary process? In this event, we're going to explore all of these questions and a whole lot more. Now, let me take a moment to sketch out the structure of today's program. We're going to start the event with Rachel Snyderman, Managing Director of Economic Policy for the Bipartisan Policy Center. She's going to give us an overview of the federal budget process and some of the language of the federal budget process to help us all get on the same page, because this is complicated stuff. Rachel, I should add, previously worked at the Office of Management and Budget and in other executive agencies, so she's going to be a great guide on this topic. Next, we'll hear from Nat Malkus, Deputy Director of Education Policy here at AEI. He'll dive into Doge's receipts and explore its methodology for deriving cost savings numbers and share with you some of his own findings. After that, we're going to move to a panel discussion. That's going to be led by Ramesh Ponnuru, non-resident senior fellow here at AEI and the editor of National Review magazine. Nat, Rachel, and AEI senior fellow Philip Wallach will all participate in that discussion. After that, we'll have audience Q&A, and the event will be followed by a drinks and light eats reception for in-person attendees. Sorry to you who are beaming in online, you'll miss that. Now, before I welcome Rachel to the stage, let me mention that if you want to submit your questions online, you can do so at any point during the program. You don't have to wait to the Q&A section. You can just put it in as it occurs to you. You can do that either by emailing your question to Greg Fernier, that's Greg, Fournier @aei.org, or you can post it on x.com with the hashtag #AEIDoge. All right, with that, let me step aside, and would you please give a warm welcome to Rachel Snyderman at the Bipartisan Policy Center.
Thank you, Kevin. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to join you all today. It is truly an honor to be here alongside Kevin, Nat, Ramesh, and Phil to discuss one of the most consequential issues, nouns, and verbs of our time. As Kevin said, my name is Rachel Snyderman. I serve as Managing Director of Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. BPC is an organization located just down the road that works to ensure that policymakers seek consensus across party lines to craft durable policy solutions. And I find myself up here speaking with you all today because I love talking about the federal budget process. And given Doge's initial mandate to find $2 trillion in cost savings across the budget, it's important to provide some of that context. So here we go. So Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution grants Congress the power of the purse when it comes to federal spending. Congress demonstrates this authority annually through the appropriations process, allocating nearly 1/3 of the $6.8 trillion in spending across various government agencies, programs, projects, and activities. Now, the executive branch, principally tasked through the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, is then responsible for the administration of those funds to federal agencies, seeing to both their allocation and disbursement across agencies as instructed by Congress. Now, more than 50 years ago, Congress codified that process as well as the checks and balances necessary to ensure its integrity through legislation called the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. Looks pretty simple, doesn't it? Now, I only share this slide to demonstrate that the budget process is anything and everything but simple. It's extraordinarily complex, but it is important on this slide in particular to demonstrate the process of federal budgeting cannot be done by the executive branch in isolation. Congress must be involved. The legislation that actually built the modern budget process that we see here today was actually the result of President Nixon dramatically increasing his use of withholding funds and impounding federal spending to advance certain policy goals back in 1973. Now, while I won't walk through the entire budget process, as I promised, in excruciating detail, certainly ahead of Nat's presentation, as he's going to give a deep dive into the wall of receipts and what Doge is up to, it's helpful to highlight some common budget terminology, especially given Doge's activities today and what's happening at the federal contracting level. Now, in addition to the governing statute, the ICA, the Impoundment Control Act, there are a few other terms, such as budget authority. This is often referred to as funding, or the amount of money that's available to a federal agency for a specific purpose, the authority of which is provided by Congress, not the executive branch. Apportionments. These are legally binding documents overseen and implemented by OMB to guide agency spending and ensure that appropriated funds last the duration of Congress's intent. Now, once those appropriations help guide the federal obligations. Once budget authority has been appropriated and apportioned, an agency then can incur an obligation, which is a legally binding commitment to spend such funds as directed by Congress. So for example, this is when the Department of Education incurs an obligation by entering into a contract with a third-party evaluator. Now, outlays occur when a federal agency issues payment to realize an obligation. So think of disbursements of federal grants when that grant hits grant recipients' bank accounts, or when the Social Security Administration, for example, disperses payments to beneficiaries. Now, lastly, a term that has come up quite frequently in recent discussion and in the news is impoundment. And this refers to the delay or withholding by the president of funds previously approved by Congress. Now, these funds may have been previously appropriated by Congress, but not yet apportioned or obligated. But the president cannot legally impound federal funding without explicitly requesting and receiving approval from Congress. We'll get back to that in a slide or two. Now, I've highlighted here some important budget, some key points in the budget timeline because we are going to soon see President Trump release his fiscal year 2026 budget request to Congress. Now, while that comes out in the coming weeks, we anticipate it is going to be really interesting to see, first and foremost, how Doge's activities are included in the budget request, how savings are, how the anticipated savings are realized, what the department's plans are for the next fiscal year. But it's also important to note that the president's budget is not a legally binding document. It is an instruction to Congress of what the administration would like to see happen over the across the federal government. But from there, all eyes will turn to Congress. And of course, right now, Congress is in the middle of not negotiating its fiscal year 2026 appropriations, but its budget resolution for fiscal year 2025. So shortly, Congress is going to then have to catch up and pass appropriations ahead of the start of fiscal year 2026 in October 1st. If they do not do that in time, we will face a government shutdown. But what has to happen before October 1st is that Congress has to pass appropriations or continue to fund the government on the current year levels, called a continuing resolution. So then, by October 1st, OMB can then apportion that budget authority passed by Congress, and federal agencies can begin to obligate and outlay that funding. Now, there's been increasing speculation and concern over the past months as to whether DOGE is acting in accordance with the rules of the road when it comes to the federal budget process, which is why I turn to the topic of impoundment next. So when it comes to budget impoundment, there are a few ways that I like to think about it, describing it. First, through the procedure, the process, and then enforcement. So the Impoundment Control Act, as I noted earlier, established an orderly process by which the president can temporarily withhold federal funding while at the same time requesting of Congress to permanently reduce such funding. This is what is called the rescissions process. OMB can request to Congress to cancel certain budget authority outside of the regular budget timeline and the regular budget process to address differences in policy decisions between the legislative and the executive branches. Once OMB sends the requested rescissions to Congress, Congress then has 45 days to affirmatively approve such a request, during which time OMB can exercise the apportionment process to temporarily withhold funding. Absent affirmative congressional action or approval of the rescission package in full or in part within that 45-day window, OMB then must release that withheld funding to all programs and agencies under consideration. Now, presidents can also only recommend rescissions to discretionary funding. They are not able to touch mandatory programs such as Social Security and Medicare. But I think this is important to highlight because we're talking about funding. The rescissions process can touch funding that DOGE is precisely going after. I mean, we're talking national defense, education, veterans benefits, international assistance. So there is a legally viable process through which DOGE can or could realize the savings that it is after. Now, lastly, there's an enforcement mechanism. The Government Accountability Office is tasked with ensuring that the administration is following through, serves as a check and balance to ensure that the administration is following the rescissions package, the rescissions process correctly. And the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, also has the authority to sue the executive branch if they find that they are withholding funding through a duration that exceeds that 45-day window, or if they have not followed through the process by appropriately sending such a request to Congress while they are also withholding such funding. Now, I bring up this slide because these are arcane statutes of legislation. I mean, certainly not arcane to me and to some of those in the budget community, but these are complex processes that actually presidents throughout history and since 1974 have routinely utilized. So we can see on this chart, for example, that Presidents Clinton and Trump's first administration utilized the Impoundment Control Act's rescission process to request the impoundment and cancellation of certain funds. Now, President Reagan, for example, throughout this period actually sought half of all rescissions requested over the last 50 years, while Presidents George W. Bush and Obama did not utilize this authority at all. What I think is also interesting to note, though, is that, of course, Congress can request its own rescissions through the annual appropriations process. And as shown on this graph, they did so for about $383 billion worth of rescissions that have been passed, proposed by Congress and passed in legislation over the past years. Now, before I turn over the mic to Nat, I want to leave with a few parting thoughts. First, DOGE is testing the limits of presidential control over federal spending and potentially setting the stage for court cases and a Supreme Court ruling on the president's power of impoundment. But I think it's also critical to note that there is a formal, legal, and expedited process that exists through the Impoundment Control Act to realize actual budget savings. And because Congress has already approved funding that DOGE is seeking and going after, Congress is going to have to rescind that funding to realize those savings. Canceling contracts doesn't change what Congress appropriated and obligated to agencies. That funding will remain obligated at that agency. And second, yes, waste, fraud, and abuse exists across the federal government. At BPC, we have focused on improving efficiency and reducing fraud across programs from unemployment insurance to tax administration and AI procurement. It's also why the government has independent bodies to investigate, from agencies, inspectors general to the Government Accountability Office, who publish thousands of recommendations on an annual basis. So if one of the primary goals of Doge is reducing waste, fraud, and abuse, it is inconsistent with the administration's recent firings of inspectors general whose jobs were to do just that, among other critical responsibilities. And third, if you want to talk about savings, those that met Doge's short-lived goals of cutting $2 trillion in savings, it is not in the nearly 1/3 of the budget of discretionary savings that's negotiated annually by Congress. Yes, canceling contracts, reducing the federal workforce, and ending leases has been incredibly disruptive. But this is not where the real savings, nor the real drivers of our $36 trillion national debt exist. At BPC, we have long called for sensible, durable reforms to entitlement programs and the need to rein in deficit spending, which, going unchecked, will see net interest on the debt eclipse defense spending once again this year and remain the fastest growing share of the federal budget, behind only Social Security and Medicare. And so with that, I would like to bring up my fellow panelists and AEI's Nat Malkus to the podium. Dive into the wall of receipts.
Good afternoon. So if you were listening during the introduction, you might have noticed that I'm an education scholar. So just to start out with, when I get up here to talk about Doge, I want to answer why the education scholar is up here. The first list of Doge contracts that came out wasn't actually posted, it was leaked, and it was a bunch of IES contracts. That's the Institute for Education Sciences. I'm a education data guy, that's right in my bailiwick. And so I wanted to know, what were these costs? What do they match? Does the talking points match reality? And I matched this to a list of contracts that the department put out, and it didn't match. And so down the rabbit hole I went. I'm going to take you down that rabbit hole briefly here with a couple of specific contracts, because I think that Doge has an ability to do what hasn't been done before, really make cuts into government spending that is pretty elusive and difficult. I want them to do a much better job than they've been doing, and I'd also like them to communicate their savings more clearly with fidelity. So let's jump into the wall of receipts. This is a screenshot of Doge's website. Right up there, estimated savings of $140 billion. This is from a few days ago. The last update was March 30th. You can see it with a spyglass if you look. All the work that I'm doing today is from a previous update. They update about every week, and I just can't quite keep up. So I'm doing the best that I can. Nonetheless, I got all the contracts, which you can see on this page, is the sort of the way they list them from March 19th and match the majority of them. So here's the wall of receipts contracts. These have been terminated, most of them in full and some partially. They have been, for the most part, terminated legally. There's a clause in most of these contracts that say for the convenience of the government, and so they're legal. And that is important for a number of factors we may get into down the line. You can see right here, if you can read that first contract, the Department of Interior, there's a company called Family Endeavors, Inc., and that's a $3.3 billion contract. Not much next to the deficit, but still real money. And if you watch the purple in the corner, you can see you can also map it by savings. And for this contract, there's about $2.9 billion in savings. You can keep diving down in this. You can click on the little square with the arrow coming out of it, and it'll show you this little caption for the Family Endeavors contract here. And again, we see the total contract value of $3.3 billion and $2.9 billion in savings. And you probably can't read this, but this is for the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And it's for a facility and care for up to 3,000 unaccompanied alien children. So $3.3 billion for 3,000 kids is about $1.1 million a kid. So right off, I'm starting to scratch my head and say that really, even for the government, that seems expensive. So I compared this data and looked it up on a government website called USA Spending. So God bless USA Spending. This gathers data from the FPDS, which is the Federal Procurement Data System. And if you have the longevity, if you have the persistence, you can actually kind of get to things. So here you'll see I searched for this contract, and there's family endeavors. You will notice that there's a different number than the contract value or savings. It says obligations, which was talked about earlier, and that is not 3.3, and it is not $2.9 billion. It's about 400 million. So let's go down another level. This is the page for that contract on USA Spending. And there's family endeavors, and here we actually have a number of figures for this. And so we're going to sort of match to some of those that Rachel had talked about. And also, we'll just compare this to the screenshot from Doge. And I'll take applause later for my animation game because I think it's pretty good. So the $3.3 billion is right there in the potential award amount. And I'm going to just remind you quickly what that means. The potential award amount is how high this contract could go if all the options were exercised. So it could be multiple years, there could be a lot more unaccompanied children, there could be reasons that the value of this contract would need to be escalated. Lots of government contracts work like this, where the potential is higher than is currently contracted, so $3.3 billion is where it could go. The obligated amount for this contract is $428 million, so far, far less, a fraction of it. And when you think about those 3,000 kids, it's still expensive at $427 million, but it's about 140 grand per kid instead of 1.1 million. So it's getting into sort of government spending territory there, I think. And one number that is not mentioned anywhere on the Doge site is this outlaid amount. The outlaid amount is what we've already spent on this contract. So let's put together the Doge math, and then I'll show you what I think the savings are for. And I need you to recall that these contracts were terminated. They were legally ended. So by and large, to start this back up again, you would have to recompete the contract. There's other people out there, many of whom have had trimmed contracts and now want to do business with the government, and that can take quite a while. So these actions of canceling the contracts have some sort of timeline problems. Okay, so the Doge receipts, they say we have a total contract value, and that's this potential award amount. It could go up there. It doesn't always get up that high, but it could get up there eventually. And then they subtract the obligated amount here in orange, and that gets you your savings. So 3.3 billion minus 427 million is about $2.9 billion. That's a lot of savings. Of course, that's not contracted for yet. The outlaid amount is absent. I would say that the savings for terminating a contract, stopping the work on it, would be the obligated amount minus what we've already spent on the contract, right? What was the contract for? That's in orange. And the green is what we've already spent, and that gives you a different savings figure. So the Doge is 3.3 billion minus 428 obligated for 2.9 billion in savings. It's actually, according to my sort of math, 428 million in contracted value. 283 is already out the door. That leaves about $144 million in savings for this contract. The work that stopped that we no longer have to pay for. This is a strict definition. Let's get a little stricter. When you cancel a contract, there are some closing costs, right? There's some work that's already done. If that's about 10%, the government probably saves somewhere in the $100 million ballpark here. I audited the whole wall of receipts. I matched 5,545. That's about 95% of the receipts that were up there. So you don't have to, and believe me, you do not want to. It's about 88% of these contracts, the potential total value in USA Spending equals Doge's value. They do other things other times, and you can't quite actually track it down. Sometimes there's mistakes, sometimes there's choices that make sense, including if it's a partial termination. Get that in a minute. So there's a number of times when you need to look at sort of down the list, but you don't always find a solution. This roughly 46% of contracts is very important to understand the whole wall. In almost half the contracts, the potential value is the obligated value. And Doge lists its savings as 0. So if they were maximizing their savings, they'd probably do something else in these 46% of contracts. So we shouldn't just say, oh, well, they're just manipulating it to maximize their savings. If they wanted to do that, they should call me. I'll tell them a better way to do that. There's a number of sources of error, and I'll just go through these quickly. Some contracts are called indefinite delivery vehicles. This is basically like a big contract where you can get out smaller contracts later. These are very difficult to deal with, but they make a lot of sense why the government would want to do them. But in 162 cases, the values were so strange that I just used Doge's values. So when there was a tie, I gave the tie to the Doge runner. I dropped 230 contracts or so because it was just crazy. There was no way to match them, so I just dropped them out. Partial terminations are also uncertain. That's when the clock is still running. They tell you when the contract cancels. I also sort of gave the tie to Doge. But there's also errors. So the New York Times has highlighted these relentlessly. There was an $8 billion contract that was actually worth $8 million, which is quite a difference. There was another $1.9 billion contract that was a $1.9 billion contract, but it was canceled under the Biden administration, so previously. In my work, I haven't been sort of listing these out, but there are 48 additional contracts canceled by the prior administration. I found 16 IDV contracts that had one value for the parent contract, and elsewhere they also had the child contract, so it was double listed. I like to say the word fat-fingered, so there's some fat-fingered values in here. There's one contract for $3.8 million that was listed as $38 million, and I just have to put this on the board that is very astonishing for a bunch of guys who are supposed to be great coders, because that means at some place they're pasting data or they're typing data in. And then there are some contracts that I went down the rabbit hole on because they're education contracts that I know, and they were overvalued, and I talked to some folks with whom the contracts were, and they said, I have no idea where those contracts, but they've been listed repeatedly. So when they're overvalued, I leave them as overvalued. For the ones as of March 23rd that I downloaded and looked at, the 95% match, Doge's total contract value was $46 billion. Their savings summed to about 20. When you match them by USA spending, I adjusted some of these, like I just mentioned, tie goes to the runner, that goes to Doge, about 45.6, so pretty close for the total potential value. Those are obligations of about $24 billion. In other words, the potential value was 46, but the contracts that were currently held by the government that wouldn't need any more commitments to rise would be about 24. We'd spent about $14 billion already on those contracts. The government has already cut those checks. So the real savings on these terminated contracts is about $10 billion, about half of what Doge claims. Now, I think it's very important to just draw the point here to the terminated contracts. The terminated contracts are done so that the contracts are dead letters, so they cannot be escalated. But it's important to say that, what did we save from terminating the contracts? Well, the Doge value is how much it might have risen. But if you control the agency, then instead of canceling the contract, you can tell the agency head no more escalations in contract values. And the Doge savings can be realized without terminating the contracts. So could Doge save some money because of those terminations? Yes, but they could have done it without terminating the contracts. And so they are claiming contract values that are higher than they likely are. They're talking about savings that they're not necessarily saving and certainly don't need to save through contract terminations. And inexplicably, The amount that I say they're saving, the difference between what they've contracted for and what they have not paid, is not included in their savings figure. So their actual savings, they are not claiming. This is fairly puzzling, and there's more to talk about. I will just put up here the distribution is also telling, because I think Doge is not necessarily only going for places where they can cut, but where places they are targeting cuts. And I think that this changes over time and probably will, but we've heard that USAID has been sort of decimated, and indeed they have. 40% of all the contracts that have been canceled, again as of March 23rd, were with USAID. 58% of the value, as Doge values them, USAID, and 73% of the actual savings. You can see that this pares down very quickly, and once you get past Treasury, every other agency is below 5%. I just include this because I think it's a different angle on the money that we're saving. So I think that this all goes directly into what Rachel was talking about as far as we're going to need a rescission to do this, but I think that the panel will do best to take those things apart. So I'm going to close it up there.
All right. I wanted to ask a couple questions about those numbers to start with. One would be all the personnel cuts that we have been hearing about, all the layoffs, do those factor into those numbers?
Yes, that is an excellent question, and I should have made clear. There's actually more than just the reduction in force, and no, those were just from the contract numbers. So that's a subset of the Doge effect and from the Doge posting. So the actual savings for reduction in force numbers and so forth are not on the website, and those are not included. There's also grants. And I have not jumped down the rabbit hole in the grants, largely because the data to follow them is less available on the website. And also, as far as leases go, I know nothing about government real estate leasing. But all those three parts, leases, grants, and reduction in force or federal workforce reductions, are not included in those numbers.
And I take it then that the potential costs of the buyouts are also not in those numbers.
Yeah, they're not in those numbers, and neither, so there's the cost of the buyouts, and then there's, you know, when I was saying, well, there's a potential value for the staff, there is a real value for those salaries. I'm not sure how much money it makes versus the $2 trillion target, certainly versus either interest spending or defense spending. Those are very small, but they are real savings. So we're gonna save that money next year because, well, at the Department of Education, there's 1,300 less people.
Okay. Rachel, I'm going to ask you for your reaction to this this kind of audit that we've been conducting here, but in particular, if you could zero in on the question of what kind of Doge dividend are we likely to see? Because of course that's something that the administration, including President Trump and Doge semi-director Elon Musk, have been discussing.
Yeah. So I'll answer your first part, the first question, or the first part of your question first. I think you've done an extraordinary job, Nat. I mean, we've had a lot of fun going back and forth over the past weeks over your research, and you know, I think
you guys have a very different definition of fun. Than,
we do, I guess,
than a lot of us.
But
Please continue.
You know, what I think is going to be very telling is, again, you know, these are still funds that are sitting within the federal government. You know, even though they are now not going towards certain contracts, they're sitting there obligated at federal agencies. To fully realize those savings, it's going to take, you know, how they're represented in the president's budget in a few weeks, or whether or not a full actual rescissions package will be sent up to the Hill to ensure that those are actually decreasing or increasing savings and decreasing federal spending. You know, to your second point, yes, there are reports that the administration is considering sending out dividend checks or Doge dividend checks of upwards up to $5,000 per per taxpayer that actually has a positive tax liability. So this isn't the 40% of Americans who file their taxes and don't pay federal income taxes. So I think there are obviously some questions as to, number one, cost. That's a pretty expensive check, especially that's more than the sum of the economic impact payments during the height of the pandemic. You have to question the progressivity of such a decision if you're sending those to individuals who, that exclude that 40% of individuals who don't pay federal income taxes. And again, there are some, if part of this is to socialize or to get voters and more excited about cutting federal spending, I think there are more efficient ways to do that, which Congress can do on its own right now.
Right. In addition to contract terminations, of course, Doge has purported at least to identify large-scale fraud in various programs, and particularly in Social Security. How can we take those numbers to the bank?
Do you want to jump in?
If they realize those savings, we'll all be cheering, is all I can say, right? We will really be in a much better fiscal position than we thought we were if we find that actually there are millions and millions of people receiving Social Security benefits improperly. But so far, all they've shown really is that there were a lot of numbers assigned to people, aged implausibly in their database, not that those people were actually receiving benefits. So I think they've gotten a little bit ahead of themselves in talking about how dealing with that problem, which is a real problem of maintaining the database at the Social Security Administration, is going to lead to actual realized savings.
So you've written a lot about the separation of powers and the sort of the atrophying of congressional authority in our system of government. I wanted to ask about the questions that keep getting raised about whether Doge is exceeding the permissible boundaries of executive power. In particular, USAID, Nat was saying, was a particular target of these cuts, but you at least keep encountering the argument that you can't effectively eliminate this program that's been established by Congress. What are the merits here legally?
Yeah. Well, let me first just say, we're not having a panel today to discuss what is Doge, but that is in itself a challenging question, right? We know there was this digital service, and by executive order, it was converted into an agency that houses a certain number of people who are Doge, but Doge is also out amongst the agencies. There are Doge people in each of the agencies, and Elon Musk, as you alluded to, is sort of the head of Doge, although not officially the head of Doge. And so Doge is a little bit of a brand name for a lot of different kinds of efforts in the second Trump administration. And so some of the things that Doge would do would be classically realizing efficiencies in administration, all the sort of computer stuff. Nobody's going to get upset about we found a better way to run this agency's computer systems, and it's now saving taxpayers millions of dollars because we did it. That is a different category than saying Doge has realized that this whole agency is corrupt, and now we're shutting it down in spite of the fact that congressional appropriation statutes say that we ought to fund it, right? That sounds an awful lot like impoundment, although the administration has been reluctant to go ahead and just say we're doing impoundment because this is bad. They want to make it seem as if they're just doing the realization of stopping the waste, fraud, and abuse, right? But really, it's hard to square those two things, right? When you look at USAID, they seem to be saying the whole agency was shot through with corruption, and therefore shutting the whole thing down is somehow saving the taxpayer money that they ought not to have been spending. But there's a lot of steps in that logic that are kind of left as exercises for the observer. So, I think to the extent that Doge seems to be acting as a substitute Congress to make substantive legislative decisions, that raises a lot of serious separation of powers questions. Now, of course, who should vindicate Congress's interests? It really needs to be Congress most of all. I mean, we'll see how the courts end up playing into it. They may strike down a lot of these actions, but ideally, we'd like to see each branch of government protect its own prerogatives. So far, congressional Republicans have mostly wanted to associate themselves with the Doge brand. They think that they want to say, of course, we want to cut down waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. Of course, we support.
Although apparently in letters to constituents, a lot of them are saying
yes,
something
so
at least tonally
I
different.
think in the last month, you've started seeing more specific members saying, hey, these cuts in my district I'm not so keen about, and maybe more backroom, more back channel, but sort of a sense that they are concerned about the sort of haphazard buckshot approach that Doge is taking rather than actually going through and being more careful about what really is fraud and abuse.
Is there a possibility that Congress sort of blesses some of these decisions, at least retroactively, in this reconciliation process that we are sort of stuck at the beginning of?
So right now, the Senate budget resolution has a prerogative to find $4 billion in spending cuts. The House budget resolution has a prerogative to find $1.5 trillion in spending cuts. They can, but this is where the political choice to I think the question is going to be are lawmakers deficit hawks or spending cut hawks, and where do they really, because the tax side of the equation is what's really driving up a lot of the deficit concerns here. But these are going to be in some cases hard sells to voters, and I think, as you said, through a lot of conversations and town halls at home, these have been very challenging. So, but if Congress does care about getting our fiscal house in order and seeing to hard choices on the spending side of the equation, they have the opportunity.
I will say that one aspect of this that I want to make clear, because I said, well, these are the real savings. And while they are the real savings in a sense, they're not real savings until Congress acts to make them real savings. It's not like they go back to the Treasury. And one might think, well, that's dumb. Why shouldn't they? And I'm not an expert on those things, but part of the reason is because we don't want a slush fund for agencies where they can cancel contracts and then do something else. So there's good governmental reasons for this. But unless Congress acts, the potential savings that I outlined don't turn into savings, they stay with the agencies. And I believe if they stay with the agencies past October 1st, many of them stay there for 5 years, locked
It depends on the budget authority
Right.
that's provided by Congress. But I think you bring up an excellent point, though, that in the past, we saw the $300 billion of rescissions that Congress has approved and passed sessions. But it's important to note that many of those savings were actually not realized. They were just to allow Congress to move funding elsewhere under the discretionary caps that were allowed. So, these are going to have to be hard choices for Congress to make in order to actually realize such savings, as opposed to moving it over to from the Department of Education to the Department of Defense, for example.
Phil?
Yeah, I would just add, remember that if you stopped the contracts that were allowing you to fulfill some statutory responsibility, and you had to pay the termination costs along the way, by the way, you still have the statutory obligation in almost all these cases. Mm-hmm. And so you could, in the reconciliation bill, change lots of statutory obligations all over the place, but actually reconciliation only allows you to do some kinds of things, right? It's a restricted process by parliamentary rules. And by the way, the politics of the reconciliation bill are hard enough without broaching every single one of these fights. So there's a good chance that most of the statutory responsibilities on the books just stay there, and the administration has booked the savings for having canceled the contract, but it will just have to undertake new contracts or find a way to hire personnel to perform these responsibilities itself. So you could make a good government argument that these contractors were bad and we're going to get good ones. They're welcome to make that argument, but it's very different from saying, we have saved the taxpayers this money forever and somehow are going to get the same value without ever spending it, right? We have things we are trying to do by spending this money, and just canceling the contracts doesn't get them done.
So if Congress balks, and I have to say that $4 billion figure is pretty amazing. That's a 10-year figure. They're expecting to get they're hoping to get $4 billion in savings over 10 years.
That's just in spending cuts, though.
Yeah, right.
We plan on adding $5.3 trillion in
right,
tax cuts.
Then how far does the president's impoundment authority go? I mean, you've heard some talk to the effect that there are people in the administration who think the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional and is ripe for some kind of legal challenge. I guess on the argument that there's some inherent executive power to impound that it transgresses. Do we think that that is the fight that is coming, and what might that look like?
You want me to go first?
Sure,
Okay.
go ahead.
I mean, I think it's logical to assume that that fight is coming, given some of the statements that we have seen from administration officials. I do think it's important to note, though, that the administration has exercised the rescissions process that is outlined in the Impoundment Control Act. They did so in 2018 to request rescissions of upwards of, I think it was $14 billion or $15 billion. Congress did not. Actually, the House approved that rescissions package. The Senate ultimately did not, so it failed. But I think that this is where, with the actions out of USAID and other federal funding that has been withheld, this is certainly, I think, where the conversation is going to be going ultimately, to the courts and perhaps the Supreme Court.
I would just add, the current or incoming general counsel for OMB, Mark Paoletta, while he was in think tank land before this administration was elected, wrote a paper explaining why he thinks there is a long history of a sort of unlimited impoundment authority, and the nation took a wrong turn in 1974, and the Trump administration is going to go back to the correct path, where we see all congressional appropriations as setting a ceiling on how much the executive branch can outlay, not a floor. So basically, any time the president wants to reap savings by not spending up to what Congress appropriated, it would be within his power to do so. It's worth saying that is a very far out legal position. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously, as Rachel said, in 1974, that the way that President Nixon had been using impoundment was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court struck down the line item veto that Congress enacted in 1995, or 1996 maybe. That's a situation where Congress was trying to give the president the power to have sort of strike down particular spending items, but the court said, no, you do not have the ability to give the executive branch or the president that kind of authority. That would distort the separation of powers. That would mess everything up. Really a pretty strong Supreme Court majority there as well. So it would be a big surprise, or it would be a major legal development, at least, if the Supreme Court were all of a sudden to just say, oh, actually, the president does have this authority.
Yeah, and also, just add, again, that the 1974 law did not restrict the president's powers or take away presidential powers. It provided an orderly process that was not outlined before in statute to allow the president to temporarily withhold funding for different reasons, from policy reasons to cost efficiency reasons as well. And so it's important to kind of to highlight that, because especially as we're talking about what's to come.
I think it's also important to say Congress can make appropriations of the form spend up to this amount. They do it all the time. So when they do that, then it's clearly within the executive branch's discretion not to spend up to that amount. But that's just not what all appropriations look like. A lot of them just say, we are appropriating this amount, and they even allocate it within a particular time window. And it looks like that's part of the public law, just as much as anything else.
Now, you wanted to add something?
Well, I was just going to say that, again, looking at sort of the granular level at these contracts, there's, it's very easy to say, well, we wish Congress would be Congress and do their jobs, and the courts can strike them down, but they're in a real political pickle, because when Elon Musk says, well, they spent $1.4 million on this Department of Education contract for somebody to sit in a mailroom. It's insane. And people are like, that is insane. Why are we doing that? And then if the courts or Congress say, no, we want those people in those mailrooms, the game's already out. Well, that contract, which made the rounds a while ago, it was $1.3 million, but it was for sending out surveys that were very important on multiple contracts to get data out. This is tough work. It's not simple, and it's not someone watching. It's the mailroom operations. But the story's already told. And when the story's already out there and it's coming from the bully pulpit, either on X or Truth Social, but also from the presidential briefing room regularly, where you hear these things, including the first example that I had, $3.2 billion for 3,000 children. I mean, the fact of the matter is, it's not $3.2 billion for 3,000 people. But when you have to have me, someone like me, explaining the way that I'm doing, I think you've already kind of lost the populace. Sorry, I'm not more exciting.
Well, this raises a couple of follow-up questions. One is, what should we think about the opacity of this process? Because there's certainly been, a great deal of value placed on the idea of being transparent, and the sort of frenetic posting that Musk does is supposed to be in the service of that transparency, and yet it does seem as though you need real expertise and a lot of time, which I guess AEI is giving you, to hunt down these things. And even when you're done, there's still a lot of question marks.
There is. It's very difficult. And I want to also give sort of Doge's due for a second. They are taking on a lot of work. I think that they are not just simply nefarious, like a lot of my friends on the left just like to assume. I don't think that's true. It makes sense when you do something this aggressive in 10 weeks that you're going to make some mistakes. So I think there's some grace that I have for some of the sloppiness and some of the sort of silly mistakes, and they can clean those up. And also, it was very difficult to pierce their website. Since then, this may not make sense to anybody. They put up an API so you can download everything. The point is that they are giving you the keys to the data, but you're going to drown in it. I mean, I drown in it, and I'm pretty good at this stuff. Most people are going to drown in it. And then there's lots of questions about how to interpret it. And by the time you get to the bottom of this, I mean, you're well down the rabbit hole. I think there's probably 9,000 contracts in the update that's going to come today. And they vary from $3.3 billion to literally ink subscriptions. I don't mean ink, I mean the magazine at like the Department of Interior. So it's the full range. And so the transparency can starve you when it's not there, and it can drown you when it is there.
We need to talk at some point about how much is being spent on National Review subscriptions.
Indeed. I haven't seen that one, I'm afraid.
Whether we can get that number up. It would save us money in the long run.
That's right.
Another question that's raised by what you're saying is, sort of, what is the political strategy here? Do we think that there is a political strategy here? What happens when it turns out that we're not going to make $1 trillion in spending cuts? Doge isn't going to get anywhere close to it. It's not even close to it with its own claims right now, let alone if you dig into it and pare some of that back. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I have to think that a lot of it is trying to socialize the need for government cost cutting ahead of the president's budget release, ahead of the appropriations process, make that more salient. If I am a Doge official, that's what I want to be a salient issue among voters. I want to sell what I'm doing, right? Again, how that will be realized, I think we have to see, but I certainly think that is a top priority, or would be a top priority.
This takes us slightly afield from our topic here, but there are some mysteries about the fiscal strategy here.
Yeah.
The political strategy behind it that I think are really kind of baffling. So, for example, what is the point of all these Congress people saying, no, this doesn't have anything to do with Medicaid cuts, when in a couple months they're going to have Medicaid cuts if their numbers are going to add up? but and this is a sort of a similar thing. This is not a grand deception that can last for several years, right? We're talking about something where the numbers are going to be either there or not in a few months.
I think it's all about delaying the reckoning as long as possible. I mean, in large part because the congressional strategy that's being pursued right now is one big, beautiful bill that's going to be passed with only Republican votes, with the tiny margin in the House, the small margin in the Senate. You have to somehow imagine that you're going to square the political circle and make all these things add up in some way where it's close enough that the president can bully everybody into voting yes. And that's really hard. I think the degree of difficulty is like 10. And so you've raised some compelling points about, it seems like if you're going to have to get into entitlement spending one way or another. You've promised not to do Medicare or Social Security. Seems like you must be headed for Medicaid, but now you have some members saying, I'm worried about keeping my seat if you cut Medicaid, because there's a lot of voters in my district who sent me to Washington who aren't going to like that. Just not clear how you're going to get all those things to work out, but I think Doge is the ultimate magic asterisk. There's this long tradition in Washington budgeting of fudging it, right? That somehow you're going to cut waste, fraud, and abuse, and that's going to provide you this X number of trillions of dollars you need to make everything balance. Doge saying that it's going to deliver these huge numbers is a way of saying it's all going to work out in the end. It doesn't really seem like it's all going to work out in the end. You're right, Ramesh, but we'll only know that then. And at least for now, we can sort of maintain that fiction to help try to keep the negotiations together another day.
I was just going to say, I pay attention a lot to the Department of Education, sort of my home base. But there's a real question there. What about all these cuts to the department? They cut about half the staff. They gutted the statistical agency. I mean, really, really gutted it. And I care about these things. At the same time, I know that there's more spending there than there needs to be. And there's a question of, well, will it really be missed? And I think that's a crucial question here, both for the public, but for Doge. If Doge is able to, Doge the Department of Education, and for the most part, people don't really notice that much, I think that could conceivably be a win for them.
The Twitter model, right? I mean, they got rid of almost all the letters in Twitter.
Indeed.
Replaced it with one.
That's right. And if, we cut a bunch of contracts, I mean, the contracting class whines, but nobody really cares that much. That should be a signal to a lot of people, well, maybe there is a lot to cut. And what I think missing from that is a little bit of, quite frankly, not the kind of slash and burn, but the careful government work that it takes to cross the I's and dot the T's and make sure, well, this wasn't congressionally mandated, and this one was, and we don't have time to recompete it, so let's not cut this contract. And Elon Musk has said before, if you're not putting back 10%, you're not cutting enough. And again, I can give a little slack on that, but I haven't seen any of the putting back the 10%. Mm-hmm. It is important to note that some of these contracts have mods that are after the contract termination. That means it was terminated, and then they said, well, actually, let's do a little bit of the contract back. So they are putting back some things very quietly, but whether they're doing that well enough for folks at the department or government-wide to not miss the things they cut is a pretty big open question.
So I'm going to ask this for the whole panel, which is, are there better ways that Doge or something else should be looking at to cut out waste, fraud, and abuse and increase efficiency? And be mindful when answering that. I mean, I think the counter argument from people who favor something like the Doge approach would be all this careful governance just gets swallowed by Leviathan. And you have to, in fact, move fast and break things, as the cliche goes, or you're never going to get anywhere. And that's what they're trying to do. And that's why they have to be willing to make mistakes. Is there a better way, or are they right about that?
I have some sympathy for the position you just laid out, because it seems like, oh, well, we've known about massive fraudulent payments in unemployment benefits, for example, for many, many years. And we've known about it, and we've had so many GAO reports about it. And in some sense, that shows we're on top of it. But in another sense, it shows it's not getting fixed. And it's a hard problem. I don't think you just fix it by noticing it. But maybe the Doge energy is what we need. But you can move fast and move not very far and end up where you started, right? I mean, I think that if Doge doesn't find a way to work with Congress more, the best you can hope for is that it's really charting a trajectory that's going to last as long as the Republicans hold the White House, and that when Democrats come in, they're going to say, oh, thank God we got rid of those smash everything up people. Now we can go back to the old way of doing things. I don't think that's a real win. I think if you want to get people excited about reform and put in reforms that are going to last, I really do think there are plenty of Democrats who could get excited about cutting waste, fraud, and abuse. You saw a lot of Democrats lining up to say, I want to be part of the Doge caucus, right, back in December, when all this was just a gleam in people's eyes. They have been less excited about the way things have been actually going. But I think it's not too late. Elon's tenure may be limited, but Doge is supposed to be here for 18 months. We're only 3 months in. There's a lot of running room still for them to figure out how can we work with Congress in a way that Congress is going to want to put into law the provisions that would be needed to preserve this work that we've been doing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Phil's remarks. I think the only thing I would add is that use the interim expedited process that exists now to start realizing some of those savings, some of maybe the more politically palatable ones through the rescissions process, and then have let the fight play out over some of the more politically challenging ones, throughout the year. But the fact that there were reports that Elon Musk did not know about the rescissions process and was ecstatic and pounded his chest when he learned about it in a closed door briefing.
He does that a lot, though.
Yeah, I guess so. But the process exists for this very reason, and while Republicans have full control of Washington, utilize it to see some of those savings.
If they could set the precedent of making more of rescission, because to be honest, your chart that you put up was not entirely impressive in terms of the history of presidentially initiated rescissions over the last 50 years.
Not a great
that
track
they got
record.
16 out of 91 billion, that's what they got through Congress.
Or even sometimes with allied Congresses.
Exactly.
Yes. It's not actually a great record for rescission. And if you could jumpstart rescission as a tool that made a big difference in the fiscal outlook, that would be a huge legacy to be proud of.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I do think, love or hate Doge, if you can get rescissions packages through on all this sort of wrecked shop that is around, Congress doesn't have to wreck the shop. They just have to say, well, we're going to save a couple of things, but a lot of this stuff. And so you don't have to be sort of a fiscal hawk or a MAGA Republican to say, we're going to bring some of this money back in and come back next year. That's the incredible shrinking government, for people to see. Not at the scale that we actually may need to see, but I think there's an opportunity there. I think it's going to take work with agencies, and it's going to take work with Congress that we haven't seen any of that from Doge, at least on the outside. And there's one other thing, just because I do want to be sort of even-handed. What never makes the papers, but sometimes you hear in the scuttlebutt in DC, is that there are some agency folks who have reached out to the Doge folks and say, we have this problem with this that you might be able to help, and have gotten real technical help. So it's not all the headlines. I think a lot of it's the headlines, but these folks aren't just nefarious, but I do think that they're uninformed about the levers of government they need to pull to actually turn these things into savings and actually shrink these agencies.
Well, if the technical help is resulting in savings or increased efficiencies, you would think that at some point they would want to publicize that.
I think a typical administration would want to publicize that. I'm not sure that that gets the the highlight reels that they're
Okay.
interested
Right.
in promulgating.
Maybe it's too technical
Yeah.
for, to lend itself to that kind of publicity. We've talked about various ways the savings, some ways the savings might be understated, in some ways, a lot of ways, they might be overstated. One area of cost that I wonder if we could, if it were anywhere close to being able to put a ballpark on, is the cost of all the litigation that is sure to result here. Was this contract correctly terminated? Were these layoffs legal? And is that likely to be something that's really tiny in the scale of things? Or given that these savings themselves might end up being kind of smaller than expected, could it eat away a lot of them?
I think we just don't know yet.
Yeah.
It's too early. This is something that our team at BPC has been looking at and honestly tracking the daily outflows, cash flows and outflows of the federal government, and trying to anticipate, as we were talking about earlier, changes in federal salary outlays and what impacts is happening on DOJ. So I think it's at this point just too early to know, but an important variable.
To me, the legal uncertainty in general seems more costly than the actual salaries of the lawyers you're paying, right? This sense that everything is unstable, nobody is quite sure whether their business has been extinguished or not. I think the whole sort of model of being a government contractor probably can never go back to being quite the same again, right? If you're the kind of company that depended on working with the federal government on a sort of routine basis, you have to build in like a whole new risk into your equation. So I think that kind of legal uncertainty is likely to be costly beyond the cost of litigation.
I think there's also the question about what are you looking in the 4-year mark or past the 10-year mark? Because I think that there probably will be another election when Republicans do not win at some point, and that when another administration is executing contracts, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I would say let's take out that the government can cancel this contract for its convenience and put in something with some more strictures. I think that the contracting class will be driving really hard to the hoop for that. I think there's a lot of fair-minded people who will say, okay, well, we shouldn't enter into these contracts to cancel them willy-nilly, and we saw some of that, so let's put something in there that makes them a little bit more stable, and then the lawyers will have a field day if there ever again is an attempt to cancel contracts like we've seen in the past few months.
I guess that when you talk to Republicans and conservatives and libertarians about this, that kind of concern just doesn't really register, and partly because they don't think that they need as much from the government. They don't think that they think the Democrats are much more likely to view components of the government as sort of constituencies that they need to care about, and so they wonder, like, what is this parade of horribles going to actually look like if the Democrats are in charge and they start doing some of these same things?
I guess foreign aid has historically been one of the least popular parts of the federal government's activities, so they've hit foreign aid. But the Republican Party today is not really a very ambitious party in terms of shrinking the footprint of government. So we can be on a trajectory across both Republican and Democratic administrations where the state continues to grow, and like the libertarians are kind of coming along for the ride somehow, as if somewhere there's a big cut coming, and where's it coming? So I get a little bit puzzled at the complacency, to be honest.
Well, this is also one of the interesting things about Doge, is it's kind of a holdover of the kind of pre-Trump libertarian limited government version of things that we're not actually seeing a whole lot of in other areas of this administration, except with respect to deregulation, I suppose. Well, we are almost at the time where we're going to take questions from the audience. I'm going to ask people to wait for a microphone, which is going to come to you, and then we follow Jeopardy rules. The questions have to be in the form of a question. So please do that, and we'll also take some online questions as well. So do we have questions in this? informed, well-dressed, intelligent audience. We have two right there, so let's take them in a row.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti, and my question is to ask if someone could clarify how the Constitution and the Budget and Impoundment Act actually work. Because let's say the agency has a budget, an appropriated amount of money of 100, and let's say Doge or others cut the actual spending back to 50. So there's $50 in the bank that's not being spent. I think the panel said that this sits there. And let's say at the end of the fiscal year, the $50 is still sitting there, and they request a budget for the next year of 50 because they say it's getting along fine with 50. And they say, oh, by the way, since we have $50 in the bank sitting there, we don't need any new money whatsoever. So does that mean that you actually have an impoundment without an impoundment resolution going through the Congress? Or even to take it a step further, could they say, suppose they cut it from 100 down to 25 and there's $75 sitting in the bank, and they can say, and they say, well, we only need 25 for this agency's budget. We got $75. We'll take the $75 and spend it over here and over there, and we don't need any more money. So if this stuff just sits in some theoretical account, doesn't that mean that when a new fiscal year comes, you could spend it on whatever you want, so including the budget for that same agency? Thanks.
So it all depends on how, oh, do you want to?
No, go right ahead.
It all depends on how Congress writes the appropriations language. So they can write the language that mandates that the agency spends that $100 million or $1 billion within the current fiscal year. They could write it.
What if they don't spend it in that fiscal year?
So then, it depends how they write it, because they can say they must spend it, or it could be up to that amount. Now, if they don't spend it within that fiscal year, and Congress wrote that money is only available in that fiscal year, it expires at the end of the fiscal year.
So my question is, what if they refuse to spend it? It says here's $100 for this year, and they say, well, we can only spend 50. There's $50 left over. Do they go to jail for not spending the other 50, or what happens?
So it depends how they're obligating it. Agencies can have unobligated balances, so they will have that $100 billion. They will work with the Office of Management and Budget to devise how they plan to spend that $100 billion over the fiscal year. If they don't spend that certain amount, there will be some that sits there as an unobligated balance within the agency. But still, those unobligated balances, if they're only appropriated for that fiscal year, at the end of the fiscal year, they expire.
They go away.
They go away. Some agencies, however, like FEMA is a great example, is able for some accounts to carry over those unobligated balances, for example, to ensure that it has necessary resources to face natural disasters, which are hard to sometimes estimate the cost for. But it's very dependent on the agency as to whether or not they have multi-year funding, they have 1-year funding, or 2-year funding. But in most cases, that funding expires at the end of the fiscal year, even if they don't spend all of it.
And in a lot of cases, Congress has given reprogramming authority to various agencies. The Department of Defense especially has a lot of ability to move money across accounts that Congress has decided is wise to give the executive branch that flexibility. But that's very specific to where they've written these things into statute. It's not universal, and in some cases that flexibility just doesn't exist.
And I'll note that reprogramming authority is excellent, but it also requires the consent of Congress. Congress doesn't have to affirmatively approve it, but agencies still have to prepare a reprogramming notification and send it up to Congress to let them know when they are making such budgetary changes.
Same table right in front of our last. There we go. Yeah.
Hello, so my name's Abraham actually, and my question is regarding the Department of Defense. I saw the wonderful chart up there, but for example, with the F-35 program, so many different military programs, there are budget issues, scope issues, who knows what's happening to the funds. What space exists for Doge to do a complete audit and fine-toothed combing of the Department of Defense contracts and subcontracts to ensure that our national security interests are protected, especially in this new generation age of warfare?
Any thoughts on defense?
I don't have much that they don't. I don't think there's any contracts for DoD. Don't quote me on that, but there's not a large percentage. But again, Doge has sort of been making rounds, so it may just be we aren't there yet. But the answer is I don't know, but they haven't shown up yet.
And
But
it
the
requires
Secretary-
a tremendous amount of manpower, I mean, to handle the DoD.
But the Secretary of Defense has initiated his own review
That's right.
of department spending and with a savings target, with a substantial savings target, right?
I would also say defense spending is one of the areas in which Congress is most tuned in and still sort of relatively functional. The Armed Services Committees remain a place where bipartisan work continues to happen. So it's not as if all these programs are not being scrutinized on an ongoing basis, because that's what the National Defense Authorization Act, this giant bill that Congress has continued to pass on a bipartisan basis every year, is doing. So yes, fresh eyes may be very salutary, but no, it's not as if they're coming into sort of a bunch of contracts that nobody's ever scrutinized before.
Okay, in the very back there.
Thank you. Eric Rubenfeld. Question I have is, it seems to me that one of the issues with the delegation authority when Congress is delegating authority to agencies is the specificity around the appropriation, particularly since we seem to only have continuing resolutions, which gives the executive the flexibility to say, well, you told me to spend the money, but you didn't tell me what to spend it on, and I can't reasonably think of how to spend the money, versus a specific appropriation, you shall spend X dollars on Y. So in terms of the actual process, can you just explain whether there is specificity these days or there's not specificity, and would that make a difference in this issue of impoundment? Thank you.
So excellent question. No, I would say that specificity, it depends. I mean, there is the anomaly process by which when Congress is facing a continuing resolution, so they're going to continue spending or continue agency funding at last year's levels, they have the opportunity to adjust that for certain agencies. They can allow agencies to spend faster, or they can than the rate that of the appropriation that they're granted, or they can allow them to adjust certain spending across different projects, programs, and activities. But it's an excellent question to think about. How that language could be written differently. I kind of have to think more on that, but I do think that there is, certainly I'd say like through that anomaly process, one where there's the opportunity to kind of change it and update it for each year. But so you.
I would just say, I don't think Congress actually aspires to extremely tight control over every activity in the federal government. Sometimes it's all right just giving different program heads in executive agencies flexibility. And I don't think that's an unreasonable decision as a matter of governance. I don't think it's constitutionally problematic. But I do think a full year continuing resolution certainly gives the sense that Congress is kind of checking out, right? And I agree that if that's the message Congress is sending, that does sort of leave the door open for the executive branch to say, well, you checked out. We need to exercise responsibility and scrutiny in a way that you're unwilling or unable to do. So I think everyone on Capitol Hill would tell you that full year continuing resolutions are a bad thing. But that said, that's what they ended up with this year. So we need to think hard about ways of making our appropriations process work, making a budget process work. That's way out there. We've totally given up on budgeting as a serious exercise in Congress. Those are very bad things, and they do give the impression that Congress just isn't up to the job.
In the front here.
You were talking about things that the president is legally obligated to do. And yet we also have a Supreme Court that says he has immunity to do anything that he considers his executive power to do. Does he actually have to follow what Congress says, or can he do whatever he wants?
The GSA might get after him, right?
The GAO.
GAO, right, that's right, GAO.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to presidential impoundments, that's why the Impoundment Control Act had that built-in enforcement has the built-in enforcement mechanism through GAO, who has the ability to sue the federal government. They're a congressional body, and that power exists. I mean, if we're kind of looking at the process now, GAO should be conducting that audit of whether or not the impoundment, the rescissions process and federal and presidential impoundment is occurring, and what steps then are needed after that. But I have no doubt that we're going to see some sort of court case, or this results in some sort of court case.
I think you're bringing up the immunity Supreme Court ruling is a little beside the point. That's about criminal liability. I don't think that this is all very controversial, all this impoundment stuff, but I don't think we're at the point where anyone thinks that the government is doing crimes by pursuing its positions. Now, of course, if they start openly flouting decisions made by the Supreme Court, we might enter into a different kind of territory, but that's really not where we are today. So I think figuring out how to enforce the law against the executive branch, which is the enforcer of the law, does pose a set of rather thorny problems. It's no joke. But I think for now, we're not in the realm of thinking about criminal law as the tool to do that.
And the president has said that he intends to follow court orders.
Consistently.
Yes, right there.
Yes, my question is, before I go there, I worked in Doge before there was Doge. It was called the President's Commission on Privatization, Building a More Effective Government, back in the late 80s at the end of the Reagan administration, looking to privatize post office, Amtrak, Freddie and Fannie, because it had an implicit guarantee, and I worked there for a number of years, I know it well. Do you see any future of possibly, because I know Doge is hitting hard today, to privatize Freddie and Fannie, the post office, part of the Department of Education, things that have been talked about for decades? Do you think at this time it may become a reality?
I can just speak to a little bit of this, but I think it's just a different project. I don't think that's their project. I think their project right now is to make a compelling argument, particularly to their base, that they can get things done where no one else has been able to or willing to. And if you can stand sort of the wreckage, they're making that case. And you just have to, you have to be plain on that. They may not save the money that they're claiming, they may not, but as far as saying no one else has been willing to do what we are willing to do, I think that's their project, and they're clearly about it.
And people might not, I don't think people will actually care about the dollar numbers, right, at the end of the day. I think that you're right, that it's about, well, there is disruption and there is change, and this is what folks wanted to see in some levels, some respects.
Privatization of various parts of the government would clearly require congressional action, right?
Yes.
And I don't see any mobilization in Congress or outside Congress to get that to happen.
I think they have their plates pretty full to make some other, I would not, higher priority presidential campaign promises this year, especially when it comes to the tax agenda. So.
No, but I'd be curious to hear now what you think about, like, if Congress was going to pass a bill getting rid of the Department of Ed, would that involve privatizing certain functions, or is it mostly just farming them out to the states or other federal agencies?
Yeah, I don't think there's a great deal of privatizing there. I mean, a lot of those, we call it privatizing. We're already contracting with a lot of contractors, so it's already quasi-privatized. The Department of Education just does a lot of these things. That said, I think they're going to have to, if they were to try and make a real effort to get rid of the department, they would break off certain pieces. Some pieces they would just let fall. And that wouldn't necessarily be terrible. Not every part of the department is precious. I do think that post the reduction in force, post the destruction of the department, which is marked, just as a political question, I could see it being easier to get rid of the department now. One argument that you can make is, well, we can run it on an absolute shoestring, almost a literal shoestring for the next several years, or we can break it up and conceivably have it administered capably and staffed up. That's a negotiation that you couldn't have done 2 months ago, but is plausible. And for the Trump administration, if there's enough strategy around all this to conceive of that, it could be a way forward. I haven't seen that articulated clearly yet.
In the back there. Thanks. Yes.
Thank you. Hi. Would you mind, I know some of you maybe shared that you were less familiar with the lease terminations, but would you be able to share more either broadly or specifically on what we can expect going forward on how Doge may go about notifying agencies of lease terminations? Are you expecting certain markets or departments to be hit more? Curious for your thoughts.
I just do not know.
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, there's some cross-cutting things there. On the one hand, we want everybody to come back to work in person in the buildings that they're at. And a lot of government workers have been resistant to that, and non-government workers. And at the same time, we're looking for leases to cut. I think there's surplus property that the government's holding on to. And I don't necessarily know that the government has a great list of that. I mean, I don't think they're really paying attention to it. So it could be that there's plenty of just sort of holdings that the government has that we don't need to hold on to. I'm not that concerned about the property. Doesn't bother me.
I think we might have time for one or two more. One in the back right there, yes.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm a counsel at Protect Democracy. Very much appreciate your explication of these issues. I'm so interested in the thing you just mentioned recently about reductions in force and how you think about the intersection between the cuts in staff at federal agencies and the issue of impoundments. And I'm also trying to particularly wrap my head around this in instances where it's actually not necessarily taxpayer dollars at stake, but even user fees. So like the Food and Drug Administration, where there's an extraordinary number of user fees from drugs and devices and other folks who are regulated industries and have an interest in the agency working well and efficiently and having sufficient staff to do a timely job reviewing those products, or in the antitrust division where I used to work, where you need enough staff to review all the merger applications that come in, and those are filing fees with the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act. Those all look like appropriations when you're reading the bill text. They're all appropriated dollars, they have amounts, but the money's being paid by businesses. It's being paid by companies that depend upon those agencies to do that work. I was talking with somebody who works with lawyers for drug and device companies, and they said, trying to imagine the Food and Drug Administration doing its work with just the user fee funded people and none of the other people that make those jobs possible is like trying to imagine a car company firing everybody except the people working on the factory line physically building the cars and expecting that factory still to be able to build cars. And so I'm hoping you could help us like think about how do we think about savings in this context? How do we think about whether it's possible to obey the letter of maybe a flexibly written salaries and expenses appropriation, but the reality is an agency unable to do its work?
So I'll just say briefly, I think this is, I think it's called the Powell Doctrine, right? You break it and you own it. And I think that's sort of what we're gonna see. As far as like sort of instructions for how to manage these, that's just, it's not my expertise. But I do think that if these things play out, and they'll probably play out not with the general public so much, but with the sort of interest areas, if they play out such that sort of like the main government service products that we got from that area are really broken, and noticeably so, that'll be a long-term problem. And if they manage to cobble it back together so that they limp along sufficiently, that doesn't sound like a win, but I think it's going to be a win, politically speaking.
Yeah. I think that's Exactly, precisely true. I mean, I think that, the structure will hold until it breaks at the point where people feel the missed check, right, or the riff in their household, or until it becomes a personal issue where a government service that is depended on for someone's livelihood isn't there. And so that's the experiment, right?
I think Saren's also getting at just a tough legal question that I don't think we know the answer to right now, which is like, if they don't just come out and say, here, we've done an impoundment, but they're inching toward that in functionality by taking away the tools that the government would use to do the job, have they done an impoundment in violation of the act? I think there's a lot of really hard questions there about just how intentional their efforts are to fail to meet the statutory requirements. It puts courts in a very awkward position because courts don't want to be in the business of running agencies. They're just not set up for it. So they can go ahead and order an agency to carry out some responsibility, but they're not literally going to administer the agency or hire the people back that the agency would need. So I think those are a whole host of thorny questions that will come up if the administration doesn't just press it all the way to saying, okay, we're impounding, and force the court to sort of make a clear ruling on that question. I think we could end up in kind of a gray zone where there are a lot of these hard practical questions.
And we're seeing like that gray zone expand on a daily basis, right? I mean, the public apportionments website is now gone. Agency contingency plans for operations during a lapse in appropriations are now gone. Those are not, so these are, I think, some of the questions that we have to ask is, how would agencies be able to operate, or how are they operating, on the daily basis, but then in a lot of these different scenarios.
I'm going to take a moderator's prerogative here, since we've hit the time, just to make one last point about the politics, which is that failures of administration that actually affect the public end up having a huge effect on the political standing of an administration. That was true during Hurricane Katrina. It was true of the Obamacare website. And it is potentially going to be true of the Trump administration, because there do seem to be multiple potential sites where that kind of failure and stresses are being placed on them. So we're all just going to have to wait and see with some trepidation if that happens. But meanwhile, please join me in thanking our panelists. And those of you who can, please stay for our reception, and maybe you can ask some more of your great questions.
Thank you.